Okay, let me start my presentation. My name is Lukas Thomsen, and I'm today presenting mergers, product prices, and innovation, whilst looking at evidence from the pharmaceutical industry. This paper is from the Journal of Finance and by Bunai Me and Wang from 2024. Okay, let's first look at why pharma industry was used for studying mergers and the price effects. So they looked at the US pharma market, and first of all, the pharma industry is one of the most active acquirers globally. We can see on the left side a graph. We can see the number of deals and the total deal value, and they looked between 2013 till 2019, and we can see that there has been well, a steady demand. We have a total value of around 700 billion and 202 mergers, with the highest amount of mergers and deals being in 2015 and perhaps also being affected by the euro crisis, then decreasing till 2017 and then having a small turnaround. Other reasons for looking at the pharma industry is because um, we have very standardized drug quality and dosage, and therefore comparing them is very much easier. And then also ATC codes from the WHO, whereas we can define markets and drugs in those markets easier. And the US also has very good administrative data to have a more in-depth view, um, yeah, on this industry. Okay. Let me continue with introducing the competing economic views of mergers in this paper. Looking at industry consolidations, the paper introduces two views. The first is the synergy efficiency view, basically meaning that prices will fall and innovation will rise with mergers. Their theory is based on that they think that through merging two companies, there will be economies of scale, and therefore the marginal costs in a lot of areas, for example, production or let's say HR, will decrease a lot because less people are needed and already the equipment is there to produce. And they also base this theory on R&D pipelines being just larger because R&D investment of both firms gets combined together, right? Therefore, their theory is that this will lead to stronger innovation. The market power view is a little bit different. It says that after a merger, prices will rise and innovation will probably stagnate or shift to low value changes, so no meaningful changes after the merger. And the reason being that, especially in markets where this reduces competition a lot, this will increase just markups. And when there's less competition, there's also less pressure to scale up your innovation to be more competitive. And therefore, there's a weaker incentive for increasing drug development of new drugs, right? And this paper looks which of these two stories fit real-world pharmaceutical mergers. So I want to look at three research questions shown by this paper. The first one being based on pricing. So do drug prices increase or decrease in a merger where the merging firms have the same product category in the same market? For example, let's say obesity drugs. We look at Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk with Ozempic and Wegovy or something like that. And then innovation, the question being, do mergers lead to more genuine innovation? We'll look at that more, what genuine innovation means. And then shareholder value. So a merger announcement returns driven by cost synergies or just increasing pricing power. So looking at the two theories. First, let's look at the data sources. So the prices are from the National Average Drug Acquisition Cost and from the CMS just being the data released from Medicare and Medicaid of the US government. And those prices are basically based on the monthly acquisition prices paid for by pharmacies. And the good thing about this is it reflects the real cost of buying the medicine or the drug. And as shown before, it covers the time frame of 2013 till 2019. For the M&A data, they used multiple platforms, most importantly SDC Platinum and CompuStat. And they looked at deals where the acquirer moves from previously not having a majority ownership about the company, right, to more than 90% ownership. So really, so there are no connections before the merger, no big connections. Yeah. When looking at the sample, as told before, we look at 200 pharmaceutical mergers, total value of 700 billion. When looking at innovation aspect, we look at the FDA new drug application data. So yeah, more to that later. When looking at product markets and innovation metrics, we want to define treatment properly. So the paper needs a very precise measure of what a product market is. So as said before, they use the WHO ATC codes and they classify drugs based on therapeutic purpose and chemical properties. And this lets them identify exactly which markets are affected when two firms merge. So if both firms sold a drug in the same ATC market, the merger eliminates a competitor in that specific market, right? And those drugs are treated. So if only the acquirer was present and the target didn't say anything there, competition doesn't change. And that forms the control group. This treated versus the control structure is what allows clean identification later on for the DID, right? And for innovation, they rely on very detailed FDA and drug application data. And the very important distinction is between initial applications, right, which are genuine innovations, so genuine new drugs, and then secondary applications, and they are labeling updates, manufacturing changes, so not big changes in innovation, right? And the averages show that most findings are actually secondary applications, around 29.8 if you look at the firm year averages of 33.5. And a very, very small share represent real breakthroughs at around 0.5 new drug approvals, right? So this breakdown is kind of important because it prevents over-interpreting raw counts of the FDA. So innovation analysis focuses on changes in meaningful categories, not only on quantity and volume. So yeah, okay. Let me move on to the identification strategy slide. So the goal basically here is to isolate the price effect caused specifically by the merger in markets where competition actually shrinks. So the key idea is that the merger only affects pricing in markets where both the acquiring firm and the target were selling a drug before the merger. And those drugs from the treated group, products the acquiring firm sells in those markets where the target or the being acquired firm had no present in is the control group because nothing changes for them. So when we look at the model, we can see it uses a standard difference in difference setup. And the coefficient on the treated times post captures how prices of overlapping drugs change relative to non-overlapping drugs after the merging process. And the fixed effect structure is what makes our identification process clean. And products by deal fixed effects take out kind of all baseline differences across drugs within the same merger. And therefore, we are only looking at changes relative to each drug's own pricing history. And then later, the second one is then the deal by event time fixed effect, and it absorbs anything that hits the firm in a given quarter. For example, regulatory announcement, production shocks, or perhaps a pricing strategy shift in the company. And with those fixed effects in place, the variation comes purely from comparing treated and control drugs in the same transaction. And the authors also run an event study version of the model and show that pre-merger trends are essentially flat, but more on that later. And that also supports the parallel trends assumption. Yeah, let me look at the next slide, this being about the price effects and the core results. So let's look first at the event study DID. We can see instead of one post-merger effect, each quarter around the merger has its own interaction term. So the consolidate identifies products where the merger reduces competition, and QTR, meaning event time quarter, is kind of an indicator for that, right? And each coefficient measures how the price of the consolidation of products, what the difference is from non-consolidating products in that exact quarter relative to the omitted period. And the fixed effects, product deal and deal event time, remove, as you can see in the those two variables, and they remove any time invariant product characteristics and any shocks common to all drugs in the same deal at a given time. When we look at the graphs on the right side, we can see that in the first to the fourth quarter, we have the biggest change post-merger. We can see in the start a very significant change of 1.3%, and then in the fourth quarter of around 2.2%. So the effect is the strongest right after the merger in the first 4 quarters. And we can also see that the biggest price effects are in markets with few competitors, in markets where there are no generic alternatives, and in markets with high similarity between acquirer and target drugs. And we can also see in the paper that markets with strong and existing competition or many generics have very low price effect changes. And this pattern fits more and more the market power story theory, right? And not showing cost efficiency. We're looking at shareholder value. Let's look at the left side first, and we can see that we have for the cumulative abnormal return, we can see in all deals, we have an increase of 1.5%, very significant. But we can exactly see that when there's a high overlap between the firm that's merged and the acquirer, we can see there's even an increase of 3.4%. And when the overlap is not that high, we can see there's a difference of 2.3%, being at 1.1%. So basically, the logic is if synergies were really primary, then overlaps shouldn't matter that much, right? And we can see a strong link between with a higher overlap. We also have higher cumulative abnormal returns. So basically, the shareholders benefit more, and the consumers should be probably worse off. But more on that later. Before I move on to the innovation slide, I want to also show the robustness checks, because the paper actually does quite a comprehensive job in this case. The key point is that results are very stable across different definitions, samples, and specifications, which gives us kind of the confidence that the price effects we saw earlier are not an artifact of one particular modeling choice. So first, they vary the definition of product market overlap. Instead of sticking to one ATC level, they go from a very broad categories at the 3-digit level down to much narrower 7-digit categories. And the overlap definition becomes very precise, meaning that products are more directly comparable. And the estimated price effects actually get stronger. And that's exactly the pattern we kind of expect if the mechanism is market power, right? If the effects would be noise or driven by misclassification, kind of narrowing the definition would weaken it more and not really strengthening it, right? And second, to rule out that everything hinges on ATC classification, the paper also redoes the entire identification strategy using the MOA and EPC pharmacological classes. And basically, those are alternative ways to group drugs based on how they work and how they are prescribed. And the results still remain quite positive and significant, so the patterns should not depend on one coding system. And on the third thing, we can see that they also run a number of clean sample tests, subsample tests. For example, they exclude any drugs that are involved in multiple mergers, which removes possible contamination from overlapping events. And they also drop control drugs that might overlap with other deals happening at the same time. Across those restricted samples, the effects stay still very stable, around 1.6 to 3.6 percentage. And that consistency across subsamples is pretty reassuring. My fourth point is they also stress test the parallel trends assumption. The event study pre-merger coefficients are very flat, which very much supports DID validity. And even when they expand the window, include earlier negotiation and rumor periods, the estimates barely move. This also kind of helps to rule out anticipation effects. And my last point in this slide is that they also look at target drugs separately because of imperfect pre-trends. They are cautious about making a causal claim, but the general direction is similar to what we see for acquirer products, which is at least consistent with reduced competition playing a role. So to summarize, across all of these robustness checks, the evidence points in the same direction. The pricing effect is not fragile. It's very much stable across definitions, also samples and alternative specifications. Yeah, okay. When looking at the innovation part, we can see we can first look at the innovation event study and the unit of observation in firm J involved in merger K in year T. Merger indicates the merging firms, and year indexes the event time year relative to the merger. And we can also see that each coefficient captures how innovation activity for the merging firms changes in that specific event year relative to the omitted base year compared to non-merging firms. Firm deal fixed effects control for all constant differences across merging firms, and deal year fixed effects absorb any period-specific shocks that affected the entire transaction. And this whole structure allows us to observe the timing and shape of innovation responses around the merger. So when we look at the right side, we can see the effects of the pre-merger and after the merger. And we can see that for all applications, after the merger, we can see an increase in the coefficient of around 2 to 4%. But there's a big difference between initial NDAs and secondary NDAs. Whilst initial NDA applications are actually decreasing or just stagnating, we can see that secondary applications are very much increasing, especially labeling and others are missing, whilst new drug approval is actually shrinking to some extent, but still at very low values. So that kind of shows that there's no significant change in true innovation and very small low value changes for, I don't know, labeling updates, manufacturing changes. So it's more like a process adjustment. Yeah, even in the long horizon on the second table on the slide, we can see that mergers do not really increase meaningful innovation output. When we look at the welfare and public spending part, the paper also talks about the government exposure that for the consolidated drugs, that they account for 23% of the government spending with Medicare and Medicaid. This is actually quite a large share. And we can now see a price impact of around 2.2% for these drugs. And we calculate that, we come around 1.5 billion of extra cost for Medicare and Medicaid per year. So that's actually quite a high value. Um, for the overall conclusion, we can see that the evidence shows that mergers raise prices in markets where the competition weakens through those mergers. They do not lead to more innovation, at least not meaningful innovation. And we can also see that shareholders mainly gain from market power, not efficiency. And we have a very bad effect on welfare. So basically, what would be the implication? We can see that perhaps stronger antitrust scrutiny is justified, especially with deals with high product overlap or lacking generic competition. And the results consistently favor the market power interpretation theory. I want to just briefly also mention some limitations and open questions because we only looked at the US pricing and regulatory environment. So perhaps it might be also different in the European Union or here in Asia. What was also interesting was that we looked at only innovation measured by quantity of applications, but we did not really look at the impact, right? For example, we had a huge breakthrough with vaccinations during COVID, or for the obesity drug industry, like who also currently have a lot of emerging, and they have a lot of innovation, a lot of new drugs. For example, Wegovy or Ozempic, right? So perhaps it would be different in reality if we would change measuring it by clinical impact. And also, pharma industry has very long development cycles, so perhaps even 10 years would have not been enough. For example, Bayer has it took them around 20 to 25 years to innovate a new blood pressure medication to lower blood pressure. Yeah, so you wouldn't have seen that. And we did also not look at all cost synergies. Yeah, but thank you for listening for my presentation.